Okay, why don't we start? Welcome everybody to tonight's event of the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. It's a special event in some ways because it's not about Brexit and it's not about politics. It's about Enid Blyton. It says how a British author captivated children across generations and languages, and this is indeed quite true. Like many of you, I grew up on Enid Blyton many years ago, and I actually corresponded with her. I wrote her a letter and got an answer back. So this is quite sort of emotional. Special welcome to Aileen Behrendt and Stefanie Jakobi, who are going to talk to us tonight. And they've been doing a lot of research on Enid Blyton, and so we're really looking forward to hearing about it. Just a couple of household remarks. This session is being recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it again, and other people will too. Kindly mute your microphones if you're not actually speaking, but you're very welcome to keep your camera on so we can see you. And if you have questions or comments, you can start putting them in the chat as we always do it, and then we can pick them up as we go along. So the whole session tonight goes back to a conference that Aileen Behrendt and Stefanie Jakobi organized because they felt that academic research on Enid Blyton was absolutely necessary. And what we're going to hear tonight is a little bit about this piece of research and about the conference. So without further ado, Aileen Behrendt, you said you'd start, and perhaps before you have to apologize, I heard before that you have a cough and a cold, so your voice is not absolutely 100%, but I'm sure we'll get through this very well. Aileen, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Rupert. Thank you for already making my apologies. So sorry if I sound very croaky or very nasally. Thank you so much to both of you really for this invitation. It's such a treat for us to talk about our research outside the university context. And I should just very briefly announce my very brief talk has two mini parts. So first, I'll talk a little bit about how our conference came about and what we tried to do during the conference. And then I talk a little bit more about notions of a British childhood in Enid Blyton. British has a question mark attached to it here, and other conference questions that have emerged. So over to part one. Blyton's impressive number of book series have likely been part of your childhood, and I'm assuming that's also why you are here today. So you may have gone on adventures with the parrot Kiki, or you discovered secret passageways along the coast with your dog Timmy, or you imagined being sent to a boarding school much like St. Clair's or Mallory Towers. Blyton's stories were part of people's childhoods across the globe and across generations for nearly a century now, and we really felt that this is quite impressive. When we started talking about Enid Blyton academically, my colleagues Hadassah Stichnothe, who can't be here today, and Stefanie Jakobi, who you'll hear from in a minute, we were all quite baffled to find that an author with such a wide, broad reach globally and generationally has been in many ways academically neglected. So for instance, if you look at the MLA International Bibliography Database, which is a research database really important for our field of studies, you will only find 47, I checked this morning, it's still 47 entries on Enid Blyton. And by comparison, if you search for J.K. Rowling, you will find more than 1,000 entries in this database. So there is a wide discrepancy between how widely this author has been received and how little research has been done on her. And so we decided to plan an international conference on Enid Blyton to bring together the scattered research and also the scattered researchers across the globe and see what insights into her works would emerge. And we were very lucky to secure generous funding by the German Research Foundation, the DFG. Our conference addressed questions of representation and intersectional identity constructions, of cultural translations, of alterity, and of historical situatedness. But we also turned to Blyton as a brand, basically, and we turned to Blyton and her legacy. We followed a comparative approach by selecting international scholars who embody the widest possible range of backgrounds and thus research and reception cultures. So that was really quite important to us. We had participants and speakers from 4 different continents, from Africa, from Asia, from Australia, and from Europe. And our presenters explored Blyton's writing from a Nigerian, an Indian, an Australian viewpoint, alongside speakers who reflected on Blyton's work from a European, so from a French, from a Greek, from a German perspective, but also from a Polish perspective and from a post-Soviet perspective. And that was really quite fascinating to us. Now, in my second part, I want to outline a little bit what we have discussed during the conference. And I want to start with a letter Enid Blyton herself wrote to her German publisher, Erika Klopp. And in it, she presents her own theory about the seemingly universal success of her books. And she writes, "The odd thing is that no matter what foreign country the books are published in, they seem to be very popular, even though they are quintessentially British in outlook and ideas. I have come to the conclusion that children everywhere are fundamentally the same." End quote. And as appealing as the notion of a universal childhood experience, as well as the idea of a universal children's literature might be, there are a few things about this statement that might give contemporary readers pause here. One of them might be Blyton's very strong emphasis on the quintessential Britishness of her fiction that seems curiously at odds with her insistence on the sameness of children everywhere. This contradiction becomes even more pronounced if you look at Blyton's texts that go to great length to underline the fundamental difference between everything and everyone, British and foreign. I will probably not tell you anything new here when I say that her books have certainly undergone a lot of criticism for perpetuating social mechanisms of exclusion. Blyton's depiction of gender roles, for instance, has been critically analyzed with various results, and these are quite interesting. So on the one hand, there was severe criticism of her very somewhat conservative gender norms, but on the other, there was also an acknowledgement of Blyton's ability to construct an autonomous all-female space in, for instance, her school stories. Then, even during her lifetime, of course, Blyton's work has been criticized for its xenophobic overtones. In the case of the Noddy books, for instance, which was also quite fascinating because many people at the conference learned for the first time that the Noddy series also goes back to Enid Blyton. Her original Noddy series featured Gollywog dolls, and the overt racist caricature of them has led later editions to change them into goblins. Blyton's portrayal of traveler culture, of course, can also be regarded as very stereotypical and highly problematic. Blyton's work can also be said to be firmly embedded in middlebrow culture and appealing to middle-class virtues. So the term middlebrow fiction was coined during the 1920s, and it referred derogatively to works of a mediocre intellectual value. And this is quite interesting because there is a classist perspective on her writing. At the same time, of course, class also plays a vital role in her works as well. And if you read, for example, her boarding school stories, you will very quickly notice that there are very stark class hierarchies and very classist attitudes that the young readers are supposed to adopt. So these charges of racism, of sexism, of classism have led to numerous revisions and rewrites and adaptations of a body of work that has already undergone fundamental transformation in its publishing history. So coming back now to the question of what is universal, maybe, about her works and childhood by implication, we have found at the conference that perhaps it's not so much the universal appeal of her works, but a striking versatility, both on the part of the writer and also on the part of numerous publishers, translators, illustrators, filmmakers, and so on, that have transformed these presumably model British tales also into German, French, or Indian childhoods. We also talked about how and which spaces Blyton creates in her works, and we reflected on the caravan of her adventure stories, which is featured quite prominently. But we also talked about Kirin Island, you know, the island on the coast of the island of Britain. So there is a striking insularity in her works that we thoroughly discussed and enjoyed discussing. Most of her narrative worlds are also, interestingly, they are set in rural Britain, and they do focus a lot on the role of nature, and she is very rarely actually considered a nature writer. So it would be interesting to see what happens to Enid Blyton if you consider her in the context of nature writing. And that was an avenue we discussed as well. And then we reflected on how her adventure stories are never safe. So there always seems to be some danger lurking somewhere. And we thought about the historical situatedness of her works. So this is the post-war climate with the evacuation of city children to the countryside, which was very fresh in people's memories. We also, of course, talked about food rationing and the scarcity of food. And of course, that might be why food plays such an important role in her works. Interestingly enough, not always in the translations. And then we also thought about the Cold War, which is already looming on the horizon, or is visible in some of her works, because suddenly, for instance, in the famous Five, people become aware that there is a possibility of the enemy within. So what exactly is Uncle Quentin always working on in secret, and why is he constantly in danger of being spied upon? And then, of course, we also thought about the national and historical specificity and how this is maybe erased or at least made irrelevant when other cultures now enjoy Enid Blyton's childhood stories, because it might not be applicable to these cultures at all. So finally, the immense number of sequels, of rewrites and adaptation also raises questions of authorship. And this is one of the thoughts that have really carried over from the conference. Enid Blyton herself has worked very hard to establish a certain image of herself as the children's writer who would not take criticism from anyone above the age of 12. And thereby she very successfully established the Blyton brand that continues to represent her work, and even a large number of works in different languages that were written by other authors. This led us then to question who we are even discussing when we talk about Enid Blyton transculturally, basically. And how do we address the contradiction that Blyton is an international, a global phenomenon, but at the same time, Blyton's works are often used to construct myths of a homogeneous nationhood. So towards the end of the conference, having listened to all our conference speakers, we had more questions than ever about the prism that seems to be Enid Blyton. And I'll close here.
Yes, and I begin here.
And straight over to you, Stefanie. Yeah.
Yes, with kind of the question that Aileen asked at the end, like, who is Blyton anyway when we're talking about Enid Blyton, and especially when we talk about Enid Blyton in a global context. I now want to give you a tiny spotlight on the German reception of Enid Blyton and the UK reception of Enid Blyton, and to kind of see what happens when these books leap across the English Channel, as to say. It's not only because we're here at the German-British event, but also because the German reception has a special part in the Enid Blyton context, as she herself points out. She writes in a letter about the global status of her brand. Her books are translated into dozens of different languages. Although, and that's what Aileen also said, her characters are typically British children, which are British ideals of fair play, loyalty, generosity, and so on. And she says, all these nations love my books and clamor for them, but the one that clamors most, oddly enough, is Germany. Even the adults read them there. And she would love to be told why and how this should be, and asks if the reader of the letter can enlighten her. I can't enlighten you why it is Germany that clamored so much for those books. But what I want to ask, or the question I rather want to ask, is it even Blyton that a German reader reads when they open a book with a distinct Enid Blyton signature that we probably all remember on the cover? But who are we reading? And what is interesting about that, or the question might surprise a little bit, but if we consider Monde's statement, who said that the sense of her belonging to a very specific time and place is something that remains very strong in these texts. So how can we pose the question that something happens to the books when they change the national context, if at the same time they appeal to a certain sense of space and a certain sense of time? Which in this case is a very distinct version of the UK, or rather in her case, more England or Englishness. As this comment that I found on the internet shows, many of the German books that have Enid Blyton on the cover were not written by Enid Blyton, but by other authors. You might know the Mallory Towers series has 6 books in the English original. The German version goes up to 18. I think the twins and St. Clair also equally, I think they have 6, and I think they're 25 now, so they're still ongoing. With the famous 5 radio plays in Germany, we are in the hundreds. So we have many, many texts that were not written by Enid Blyton that still carry her signature. And Marcus von Jordan, talks about one of these authors, Tina Caspary, and says that for a very long time, this was a very well-kept secret. Like, not even academics or critics knew that these books were not written by Enid Blyton anymore. It always said Enid Blyton author, and then the German author as translator. So there was a very, very, so it was a bit of a secret, and some of these books were also not licensed. There are 2 famous 5 books that are called ghost editions because they're off the market now, because they were not licensed by the Blyton brand. Yes, so I want to give you a tiny bit of an insight into the secrets, which I feel is fitting for an Enid Blyton talk, to try to find out some secrets and see how these books change when they leap across the channel. And I want to look a tiny bit at the school stories Aileen already mentioned, and some of her adventure stories. And I tried to come up with as many covers as possible to, like, hopefully some of you recognize some of them maybe, and they bring up some memories. But also I brought these covers because you can already tell that there's a big change happening just by how these books are marketed. If we look at the school stories, we see here we have, like, the English version, Mallory Towers, First Time at Mallory Towers, or the Twins and St. Clair's. That gets changed to Dolly, the Dolly series in Germany, or the Honey and Nanny series. And what is important here to note is that even though the German translation incorporate many of the elements of the classic school stories, like the temporal structure, we always begin with the beginning of the school year and then follow the children for the year. We have this very specific female social space. In the Mallory Towers, I think we at most have, like, a janitor and a music teacher who is male. Otherwise, the school is a completely homogeneous gendered space, and we have the motive of the parental distance. If you look at the cover here, you can clearly see how the English school stories showcases an ensemble cast. A group of students is in the focus. You don't have a clear protagonist, and you can also tell that by how the story is told. You have multiple perspectives in the books. We have stories that not only focus on Daryl Waters, but on other characters as well. In the German version, we see that the text, even on the paratextual level, is much more tailored to the main characters. Many of the subplots are shortened or cancelled, particularly ones that give voice to other characters than Dolly, because the kind of not clear gendered name Daryl Rivers becomes Dolly, clearly gendered in the German translation. We can also see in a lot of these books that we have a clear, we would call it like chicklet or German girl book tradition or aesthetic. We have a main female character on the book, and then we have the name on it. And we have, which is typical for the Schneider Verlag, which published a lot of them, this kind of label on the side in red that reads girls. So it's clear who the audience of this book is. And what we also see, whereas here it's like a more generic school story title, First Term at Mallory Towers, the German version goes to Dolly is looking for a friend, which is thematically a more gendered approach than we have in the German version. This can be seen kind of as a pinkification of the series, and this is something that also then happens in the sequelization. The Enid Blyton version ends with Dolly or Daryl going to St. Andrews, looking forward to becoming a university student. And then in the English sequels, not by Enid Blyton, later she becomes a journalist. In the German transformations of the 60s, and kind of on par with what happens in German children's literature for girls in the 50s and 60s, Daryl can't hack it at university, to put it bluntly. She returns to Mallory Towers, or its new established sister school, which is called the Möwen Nest, the dove's nest. So she returns to the nest instead of like flying off the nest as you would in adulthood. And she takes courses in home economics and later becomes an assistant teacher, or child carer at the school. She marries her former teacher of literature, becomes a mother and matron. In German, it's called Hausmutter, house mother, so mother in the double sense of the word. And finally, without the proper qualification, becomes a headmistress, but only in tag team with her husband. So what we see in the German adaptation is just that the female space that Blyton offered its female protagonist is restricted drastically. And we have a very conformative or heteronormative space in these stories. A similar pinkification happens with Honey and Nanny. The twins at St. Clair, Pat and Isabel, turn into Honey and Nanny. We see at the covers, the illustrations are very similar, and they also no longer just experience adventures at school in St. Clair, but they meet famous Schlager stars, a clear indication that we're in the 50s and 60s in Germany, or go on a trip to Mallorca, of all places, where their teacher finds love and everyone is happy in the end. So one could argue, okay, but the school stories were always kind of a gendered experiences, so maybe this is part of this approach. But what we can see, we see a similar approach actually in regards to the adventure stories. If you look at the covers of the Treasure Hunters here, or the Boy Next Door, or even the Polestar Family, you have a clear focus on suspense, mystery, foreign exotic places, appealing to both a male and a female readership, as these books also have a female and male cast. We often have girls and boys going on these adventures together. These books get translated into the series Tina und Tini. I guess we have Honey and Nanny, now we have Tina and Teeny, and we work yet again with a clear female marketing. We have the hearts on instead of dots on the eyes. We showcase only the female protagonist, omitting the male protagonist from the book. And we also work with the signifier girl in these books. The stories get a similar treatment as the covers. Both are both the Tina and Teeny and the Ghost editions of the Famous Five are written by German chick-lit authors, Brigitte Blobel for the two Famous Five books and Tina Kasperi for Tina and Teeny. I don't know if anyone read Billa und Zottel, which is this very famous horse literature series for girls by Tina Kasperi, but she was a huge author for girls' books. What we can tell on the story level in these books is that the female characters get, via the narrative perspective, a stronger focus. So we hear more about their thoughts and their ideas, but they get sidelined during the actual adventures. So they're allowed to speak and to have these thoughts, but they're not allowed to actually partake in a lot of these adventures. And furthermore, while the original adventure stories often offer an adult-free space in which the children can solve challenges free of parental interference and thus gaining agency and becoming the heroes of their own story, this space is limited in the German counterparts. We showcase more emotionally involved parents. This is specifically done in the Famous Five books, in the classic case of the absent and emotionally distant father, Uncle Quentin, in the Famous Five series. When we meet Uncle Quentin in the originals, he constantly portrays George. Him and George don't have a very good relationship. And in these ghost stories, we have a very loving relationship. They constantly hug and kiss each other, which I feel is very out of character for George, or at least that was my feeling when I read it. And we have a relationship that is marked by physical affection, trust, and closeness. Even though this can be seen as a positive development in regards to the father-daughter relationship, it nevertheless is an instant in which the children's agency is restricted in favor of the parental influences because they are now involved in the adventure and they work together. This very short overview, or rather sketch, of the English language and German reception of the adventure and school stories show, I would argue, a genre sprung, like a leap of genre. When the books travel from the UK to Germany, they change from the adventure, from the school story, with this very particular vision of nostalgic Englishness, as Morrison puts it, into an adaptation of the German girls' book tradition. So they leave this English genre tradition and turn into this German girls' books and this very, very conservative and classic German girls' book. What this means is that if a German or an English reader opens these books, that Blyton isn't Blyton, even if they all share the same signature on the book. A German reader will have a very different experience of Blyton than an English one. So when Blyton comes back, and so we come back to her letter, is puzzled by her position in the German market, the reason might be less that there's a universal appeal to her distinct English stories, but rather that the books are very, very adaptable to different national markets and different traditions of storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you both very much indeed. This has been really interesting, and I'm really glad that I only ever read Enid Blyton books in English, so that I was not ever subjected to fake Enid Blyton. I mean, really, if I, I never realized that this had happened. Famous Five, by the way, were my favorites, actually. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I have a few there, and I'm just going to shoot them at you, and perhaps whoever feels she can just pick it up. One thing that struck me when you were talking, Aileen, that you talked about the sort of the class question, and when I sort of read up about Enid Blyton getting ready for tonight, I discovered, which I had not known, that she was actually from a, well, one would have said a lower middle class background herself. And so it's actually quite surprising that she should sort of aspire to sort of upper middle class story and then be criticized for it. It's a sort of strange sort of form of accusing somebody. Can you say a little bit more about that, Aileen?
Yes, sure. I think it might not actually be that strange because a lot of the writing, especially if you think about her school stories, it seems aspirational. So middle class is kind of the goal, I think. And a lot of the, I don't know, the morale of the story or the way that the characters are treated, if they are from lower middle class, it's never really, or it's really lower middle class. I don't think anybody at the boarding school is from working class households. It's already a very kind of classed society there. And the virtues are very firmly, I think, middle class. And at the same time, there is a lot of empathy for people from lower income households, for instance. Again, not working class per se, but lower middle classes. So it's not necessarily that she looks down in her books or that the books look down on lower middle class, but behaving in certain ways that are considered stingy or cheap, or all of these kinds of things. And so, and then there are a lot of middle class virtues in terms of how to behave, how to conduct yourself, how to be kind to others as well, and empathetic, but also industrious. So all the time you need to be, you know, you need to be industrious. You need to be a good worker, basically, as a schoolgirl. You need to be there for your community.
Yeah.
And I think these are the values that she really has. And then the literary reception is another thing, because there's a lot of classist attitudes in canon formations. You know, what makes it into the literary canon is not anything that's middle class and virtuous in that sense.
And as far as I remember, no sort of lords and ladies and big country houses come into it ever, I think.
No.
It is quite strange. The other thing that struck me when I read up a few bits and pieces was the speed in which she wrote. I mean, I read somewhere that in her prime, she would write, or she would put out 50 books a year, which means she wrote one a week. I mean, and so, of course, a lot of people, I suppose, have always suspected that she had ghostwriters working for her. Has this ever been sort of clarified? You know, who might want to take this up? Did you really write it all herself? I mean, now I'm not talking about German fakes. I'm talking about, you know, the original English. Did you write them all?
I think at least current research still suggests that she did, that she was a kind of a compulsive writer. And I know that in her biographies, her children have commented on how much she is actually committed to her books. And there was one child at least who always felt neglected because of her books, because the books always came first. And so at the moment, at least, current research still suggests that the English versions she actually wrote herself. And she, everybody who has been in her life has definitely commented on how much hours she would devote to her typewriter, basically, sitting there writing all these novels. Yeah.
And she coins a term as well, as a term automatic writing was prescribed to her writing, because she basically, and at least that's what she says in letters and her diaries, that she didn't need to plot. She just sat down and the stories came to her. And I mean, without like kind of being critical of her writing, the stories are formulaic to a certain degree, and there are similarities in like, it's like groups of children, they have an animal, they go to an island, there's a ruin, and there are smugglers, like in a nutshell. So there is also a certain element of repetition that I think made it easier to write this. But she spent hours and hours writing.
But I remember now that you say this, that at a certain point, I mean, talking about my own experience, they got too dull for me. Yes, it was sort of repetitive in a way, yes. And I went on to read, I don't know, Arthur Ransom, Swallows and Amazons, these sort of things, because they were more exciting. Yes, yes. But that was several years later. Now there's a couple of interesting questions here in the chat, and I'll read one from Mari, who says, "Do you know which series was more successful in the UK and which one in Germany? I wonder if they differ." Do you have an answer for that?
I must say, I'm not 100% sure. I think the most famous one in both is the Famous Five.
Yes, what I would have thought, yes.
And I do think the school stories were very, very popular and potentially even more popular in Germany than they were in the UK.
Yeah. But anyway, here you have something for more research. That's, yeah, any good academic conference always ends with topics for more research. So here you have one. The other interesting question, I have several more. It says, what do you think about rewriting Blyton stories like it is practiced now with many children's books, avoiding critical descriptions like Travelers? Is this done in the UK and Germany? I mean, you told us that Enid Blyton's books had been rewritten to a certain extent or rephrased, reworded. Is this common practice?
Maybe I'll start answering, and then Steph can join me for the German versions. We had one guest speaker, one of our keynotes, Siobhan Morrissey from Galway, and she looked at the different editions, at the different English editions, and how they have definitely always adapted what has been deemed critical at the time. But then there seems to be, her research has shown that there seems to be sometimes they work with editions from the 60s, sometimes they work with editions from the 90s, and there seems to be no strategic things. So sometimes they go back to an edition that has already been reworked, and it becomes kind of difficult to even understand what the original was, because there's no systematic or strategic way of doing that. So it seems that there's always this, let's say, panic reaction and adaptation of her works. But some of the structures, some of the narratives are still in place. So even if you change some of the works, and this is one of the things that might be the most controversial, if you still read Blyton today, you can see, and Siobhan Morrissey found that, you can see that some of the narratives remain unchanged. And even though some of the words may have changed, the narrative itself and the way that it is coded, you can still see that it is racist storytelling, basically. So even if you change the words, sometimes the story remains problematic in and of itself. And yeah, so that has been a debate. I think that's an ongoing debate in academia as well. But there have been changes to her stories, absolutely, for the English versions.
Yeah, and the same goes for the German versions, especially like in regards to traveler culture. And there's exactly the problem that Aileen pointed out, that we change words, but we don't change like the criminal is still coded, and you can still recognize the criminal even if you use a politically correct word now. And that is a problem, that these stereotypes remain prevalent. There is also ideas, and we see that both in the German, but even more so in the UK market, that we have new stories, both from the Famous Five, and we have that also for Mallory Towers by authors that are people of color, that use different characters, like it's called a new class at Mallory Towers, to change kind of this narrative. But I think children's literature is kind of this interesting field and also this complicated field in the sense that on the one hand, we want to talk about these books from a critical standpoint and from an academic standpoint, but then children are also reading them. Or in Germany, we have so many of the radio plays, and the radio plays are even harder to change because, of course, they were produced, and we have the voices that are known, and it's way more costly to change them. And so we have children that are 4, 5, 6 that are listening to these plays on their own, and then are confronted with these narratives. And the publishing houses now often use a disclaimer in front of the stories saying like, these stories contain sexist, racist elements, but no child will understand what that means. So yeah, it's this ongoing struggle of, do we keep these books as testaments of their time? Do we give them to a new readership? But because the books are also constantly adapted, we have the new BBC Famous Five adaptation. That also means that we constantly get a new readership to the old stories. So there is, it's kind of a catch-22 in a lot of ways.
Yes, I mean that's really interesting because obviously there are a lot of literary issues involved, if you like, and there are lots of legal issues involved. I mean, what happens to copyright? What happens to royalties? All kinds of things. So it's really good question. Does the estate of Enid Blyton get royalties for the fakes because they're published under her name?
Yes, they're part of the estate, except the 2 ghost books, the famous 5 ghost books that were not licensed and had to be taken off, but the rest is part of the estate. So the money still goes in that.
Great. Okay, let's turn to another question that's also extremely interesting. There seems to be a big disconnect between the values, kindness, etc., which Enid Blyton espouses in her books, and the way she behaved in her personal life. Yes, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about that.
I can start again.
Okay.
So we haven't really talked about her biography much throughout the conference because we wanted to focus on her literature. So this is really not, what I'm saying now is not part of the conference. That's why I'm saying that. But certainly there have been these documentaries. There have also been accounts by her children, of course. One of them who definitely had a troubled relationship with her mother. I've alluded to that before. And yes, there seems to be, I remember a particular anecdote, and I think it was in, oh, help me out, Steph. I think it was in one of the documentaries, wasn't it, where they talk about how she was not actually kind to dogs or something like that. It was definitely, so she was, at least they suggested that she was not an animal lover that she pertained to be in her books. And so there were a couple of these anecdotes where, not very kind to her own children, apparently. I mean, this is all hearsay, and these are all accounts by other people and her children. And you can imagine that at the time, there are also certain ideals of motherhood that she likely failed if she was so committed to her writing anyways. And so it's difficult to even judge that, I think, on the figure of the author. But I found it interesting that there are so many ways where they really go into, and I think you see the emotional investment here that people have in her stories, that they want her to be, this friendly aunt at her typewriter who keeps inventing all these fabulous adventure stories. And people are really invested in that and want her to also have a dog called Timmy or a parrot or something. And so I think that's where a lot of these disappointments, I think, sometimes come in.
Yeah, and I mean, she also had a very troubled relationship to her own mother. So there is a big part of that. I mean, I'm also not the biggest psychoanalytical literature academic, but there is also this idea that she kind of in her development was kind of childlike. She remained like that in a lot of times. But I kind of would like to maybe turn the question slightly on its head and ask, were the books even that, were there so many displays of kindness? Because there was a lot of displays of harshness. Like if we consider like silent treatment in Mallory Towers, like when someone misbehaved, or people being hit with the hairbrush, for example. So I think this perceived kindness often was also one that mostly focused on the in-group. And if you were not part of that, the rules of Enid Blyton's world, or like the Blyton world, were also kind of harsh sometimes. So I think there's also, in a way, this idyllic scene that we remember, where people have midnight picnics and feasts and hang with their dog or their parrot. But as a very, very, very small element, and especially feel the parental figures in a lot of the books are either distant or often absent. I think Daryl Rivers' dad, the doctor, is kind of not the exemption, or is an exemption to the rule, but like the Uncle Quentin character or many others are either emotionally distant or simply not there. And I think, that's maybe also another way of looking at that question.
Mm-hmm. So, in fact, one might argue that whole writing was a way of coping with the trauma of her own childhood. Because, I mean, I think her father ran away when she was, I don't know, 12 or something, and she didn't get on with her mother, and she sort of more or less broke off relations as soon as she was grown up, and so on. So, yeah. I mean, this is, of course, something that the children who read the books don't realize, but if you look at it as a grown up, of course, it is another way of trying to explain what she was at. Yes. I think we've dealt with most of the questions as far as I can see. I have one other question. At the very beginning, you said when you had this conference, you had people from England, of course, and European countries, and Africa and Australia, and you didn't mention America. Was this just by coincidence, or is there a story behind that? Are her books not popular in America?
That was really quite interesting, because we put out the call for papers and we could just work with the responses that we got. But from what I gathered, talking to my US American friends, and I've lived in the States for a bit, from what I gather, she does not seem to be an American phenomenon. So indeed, they maybe vaguely knew her, but even people who are really invested in literature, some of my fellow colleagues in Seattle at the University of Washington, they knew her by name, but they didn't spend their childhoods with her, is what I gathered. So she doesn't seem to be very popular in the US.
Right.
Maybe my anecdotal also impression. Yes.
So it's not entirely coincidental that
she tried really hard to get them published there, but she had trouble finding publishers. I think there were just too many other authors at the time doing similar topics in the US. So she has she has way less. She's more of a European phenomenon.
So whether the Brexiteers like it or not, she was a European phenomenon more than an Atlantic one. Yes. So do we have other questions? Please you raise your hand if you want to just join the discussion.
I'm just reading the chat.
Yes, please do. If you find anything you'd like to react to, which we haven't covered yet, please do.
Myra Davis actually said that she was big in Canada, so a Commonwealth author as well. So here you can see sort of the of the British Empire. Marie has also asked a question. I'll just read it out. Should I?
Yes, please do. Yes.
I wonder how it was like for you when you started reading books that I assume you read and liked when you were children in a critical and academic way. What was different? What was surprising for you? Did it change the way you thought about them? And maybe I'll just ask this question now, Mari's question, and I'll ask it, Steph, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a surprise to read them, because I was a huge I read many Enid Blyton ones, especially Mallory Towers. I really wanted to go to boarding school, and I was very sad that that was not in the cards for me. It's one of my many, no, not, but one of my childhood regrets if I look back. And I think for me the biggest kind of surprise was when I compared them with the English ones. I think, and I think that you also asked that earlier, because they changed, like they took so many stories out, and it was then really interesting to see, when you compare them, how much the German ones are situated in the 50s and 60s. Not just, I mentioned Schlager earlier, but the way the characters are dressed later, the interests they have, and you can really see how that changed. And that was a big surprise when I then read the English ones, how English they were, and how different they were from the characters that I gotten to know as a child. I think that was one of the biggest surprises. And I think sadly, or like kind of a positive for the English versions, was how free they were in terms of gender, and how in a way progressive they were in comparison to the later German adaptations that are so problematic in terms of body images of the girls, the relationships among the girls. Like every female teacher has to be married in the books later. They can't, and that was never a question in the originals. And I think that was really, really eye-opening and fascinating in a way, that they basically became worse.
I actually, I was really only all about the famous five. So I was like Rupert there. And for me, I listened to the cassettes, to the radio plays, but the original ones, so the first ones that were still written by Enid Blyton. And I have to say, going back to the books now, they weren't changed that much, or that it didn't feel like they were changed that much. So some of the ideas I've always had of a childhood was applicable to Brandenburg, I think, and roaming along kind of a post-industrial abandoned Brandenburg. But I think I always wanted to go to England because of them, probably. One of the most lovely, probably loveliest surprises was when I started talking about doing this conference. Most of my colleagues, no matter where I went, spoke to me and told me their relationship to Enid Blyton. And I have a lot of international colleagues across generations as well. And that was really fantastic, because suddenly everybody would talk to me about their childhood. And it was really quite amazing. And it really just, it made me so aware of how far reaching that author actually is, how widely she was received. And that was, that I really treasured that response.
Okay. Any other questions? This has been really wonderful listening to you. A lot of childhood memories come back, probably to all of us. Right now, and we have sort of come to the end of our time anyway. Yes. So. All that remains is to thank you. Thank you for doing this for us. Thank you for making Enid Blyton come alive for us. We'll probably all sort of, go in and think about it a little more. You see, and you're going to have followers, because somebody, Julia Stübers, put in the chat, can we please do more literature talk like this? This was wonderful. That's nothing much we can add to that. Same here, same with everybody, I'm sure. So thank you very much indeed. And gute Besserung for your sore throat. And yeah, we have our next event a week from now. Is that right? Yes, a week from now on the 10th, where we will have a wrap up of the last Königswinter conference with 2 of the participants, one from UK, one from Germany, telling you what happened, what we sort of took away from the conference. So I hope to see many of you back next week. Have a nice evening. Thank you all for coming in, and see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.